Welcome to this eLearn Security video on Authentication Cracking. In this video, we are going to see a network logon cracker tool that can be used to brute force services authentication such as SSH, Telnet, FTP, SMB, and so on. But it can also brute force HTTP login forms. In the first part of the video, we are going to focus our tests against an HTTP login form available on the website crackme.site. Let's start by opening the website into our browser and inspect the login page. Here we have the login form. The first step is to verify how this form works and what parameters it sends to the application in order to authenticate the users. To do this, we can inspect the source code of the application by right-clicking on the form and then select Inspect Element with Firebug. Here we have the form tag. As we can see in the first line, it uses a post to send the parameters. And the action value is login.php. As we will see in a moment, this is information that we need in order to configure our cracking tool. If we go down a few lines, we can also see that the name value for the username field is USR, while for the password is PWD. Now that we know this, we can go on and start configuring our tool. For this cracking example, we will use Hydra. As we can see, running Hydra in our terminal will print the help manual on the screen. Note that the tool is already installed in Kali Linux. Here we can see the syntax to use and the options available. Let's inspect and explain the options we are going to use. Since we want to brute force the remote login form, we will have to specify a set of usernames and passwords to use. Hydra allows us to specify the username and the password in a few different ways. We can set a single username with the -L option, while if we want to use several logins from a word list file, we can use the option -L option. The same is possible for passwords, with the -P or the -P options, which allow us to specify a single password or a word list of passwords respectively. The -T option allows us to set the numbers of tasks per host. In other words, how many parallel connections to run for the cracking. Another very important option is -U. As we will soon see, this allows us to display detailed configuration options and examples for each service we want to crack. The server and the service options are used to specify the target of our test and the service we want to crack. We can simply specify the target server and the service to crack by writing them in the command line. This will be clearer once we start writing our command. In these few lines, we can see a list of services supported by the tool. As we can see, there are many services, such as Cisco Systems, FTP, FTPS, MySQL, and so on. What we are going to use for our test is the following service: http-post-form. Note that here the S is optional, in case we want to run it against HTTPS pages, and then we have to select between the GET or the POST method. Before writing our command, let's see the service module usage details. By running Hydra -U, http-post-form. At the very beginning, we can see a brief description of the module and how it works. Right after that, there is the syntax to use. So we have to type the URL of the target application, then the form parameters to use for the username and the password, and then a condition string. By default, the condition string is a string used by Hydra to check an invalid login. What does it mean? This means that once Hydra tries a username and a password, if the response contains the string specified, the login credentials used are invalid. Note that we can also set a successful login string. Hydra verifies if the string is present in the response, but this time, it means that we have found a valid combination of username and password. As you can imagine, in order to set these options properly, we have to carefully inspect the web application behavior. Before doing this, note that at the end of this output we have a few samples that help us to correctly configure our command. Let us inspect the first example, Here we are saying to run the tool against the page login.php, that the name value of the username field of the target form is user, while the field name of the password is pass, and then that the pattern to search for invalid login is the string incorrect. So let's go back into our web application and try to log in with invalid credentials in order to check if there is any string we can use for our tests. So let's type a username and a password and then click Login. As we can see, since the credentials are not correct, the application redirects us to the login page, and the message "Invalid Credentials" appears. Let's try now to type a valid username and password and see what happens. As we can see, if the credentials are valid, we are redirected to the index.php page. So far, we should be able to use a pattern for both valid and invalid credentials. For example, if we want to set the string for valid credentials, we can set the string logout. This string will not appear until a successful authentication happens. That's why we can use it as the condition string in the tool. If we want to set a pattern for invalid credentials, we have to find a string that appears when the authentication fails. If you remember, in the test run before, if we do not provide valid credentials, the application redirects us to the login.php page, and the message "Invalid Credentials" appears. So we can use this pattern to instruct Hydra when a valid or invalid login happens. Now that we know this, we can go back into our terminal and start configuring our command. First, let's write Hydra, followed by the target website, which is crackme.site. This is the parameter server we saw before in the help output. Let's continue by setting the service to use, which, as we already know, is http:/post-form. Now we have to set the options for the service module as seen in the example before. So let's start with the quotes, and then add the resource path of the login form, which in our case is login.php, as we can see in the web application. Now we have to specify the value name for the username and password fields. So let's add a colon, followed by the name of the username field, which in our case is USR, and then this string. This is a simple placeholder used by Hydra to know where the usernames must be inserted. Let's do the same for the password by adding an ampersand, followed by the name of the password field and the password placeholder. The last thing to set for this specific module is the valid or invalid string. In this example, we want to set an invalid string, so we will type here a colon, followed by the string returned by the application when the login fails. So we will type here invalid credentials. The service module should now be configured. Now we need to specify the word lists to the user for the usernames and the passwords. Let's add the -L option, followed by the path of the username word list. We will use the minimal.usr, stored in the ncrack folder. While for the password, let's set the -P option and then the file rocku-10.txt, stored in the seclists folder. Our goal is to find at least one valid credential, so we set the option -F, which tells Hydra to exit after the first found login. The last option we want to set is the verbosity level. Let's use the -V option in order to display every login attempt the tool performs. Now we are ready to go. Let's start Hydra and wait a bit. Great! After just a few seconds, the tool finds a valid login password pair. Here we can see a pair of working credentials, which are admin for the username and 123ABC for the password. If we scroll up to the output, we can see all the attempts performed by the tool. Also remember that since we have set the -F option, the tool stops once it finds valid credentials. So let's now check if they are correct by going back into our web application and trying to log in. Awesome! We are logged in as admin. As we have seen, configuring Hydra to crack a login form is very easy. We just need to set a little information about the target application and the web form, and then we're good to go. If you remember, Hydra can also be used to crack other services such as Telnet, SSH, MySQL, RDP, and much more. Configuring Hydra for some of these services is very easy. Indeed, we will just need to set the target address, the service module, and the word lists to use. For example, let's try it against a SSH service. We know that the machine at the address 192.168.102.143 has SSH enabled. Let's verify this by running nmap on port 22 against the target machine. As we can see from the results, the port is open. So let's try to configure Hydra in order to find valid credentials for this service. In the same way we did before, let's type Hydra -U SSH. As we can see in the output, the SSH module doesn't have any specific parameter to set, so we just have to configure the main options. So let's run Hydra to display them once again, and then start configuring the full command. So let's start typing Hydra, followed by the target IP address. Now we have to select the service we want to crack, which in our case is SSH. After this, we can set the word list files that contain the usernames and passwords. This time, let's use the rocku-10.txt that is a bit smaller than the one used before. Once again, let's use the -f option in order to stop Hydra once it finds a working username and password, and the V option for the verbosity. We're good to go. Let's run the command and wait a bit until Hydra runs its tests. As we can see, since we are sending a lot of data through the network, it may happen that an attempt fails. Don't worry. Hydra is well designed and tries the attempt once again. Great. The tool stops, and after a few seconds, we can see we have a valid username and password pair for the SSH service. Let's try it and check if it works. So let's type SSH administrator at 192.168.102.143 and press enter. Now let's type the password found and press enter once again. Great, it works. We successfully authenticated on the remote machine via SSH. We can check that we are in the remote machine by running ifconfig. Here indeed we can see the IP address of our target machine. As we have seen, configuring the SSH module in Hydra is even simpler than configuring the http-post.form. And this concludes our video training lesson on Authentication Cracking. Thanks very much for joining us.